Sweden just made a move that could rewrite its relationship with the United States, and it's bigger than anyone expected. Trump's tariffs were supposed to pressure Europe's industries, but instead, they've triggered a full-scale counterstrike, one that Sweden is now leading. With billions in exports at stake and global supply chains on the line, this isn't just about tariffs anymore. It's about power, leverage, and a potential economic realignment that could pull Sweden away from Washington for good. But is Stockholm making a calculated power play, or is this a move they can't afford to sustain? Sweden's sudden escalation isn't just a diplomatic maneuver, it's a reaction to real economic pressure. Trump's 25% tariff on European steel and 10% on aluminum didn't just hit EU producers, it's now directly threatening $1.4 billion worth of Swedish exports to the United States. But the bigger issue? A collapsing krona and industrial slowdown. Sweden's GDP growth fell to just 0.2% in Q4 2024, marking its worst economic performance since 2009. Inflation, now at 6.8%, is forcing companies to hike prices, cutting into consumer spending. Meanwhile, the krona has plummeted 12% against the US dollar in a year, raising import costs and further pressuring Swedish manufacturers. Sweden cannot afford additional shocks to exports at this stage, warns Stefan Ingves, former Riksbank governor. Retaliating through the EU is now a matter of survival, not just strategy. Sweden's steel sector is already taking losses. Outokumpu, one of Europe's largest stainless steel producers, reports that the tariffs could wipe out up to 18% of its annual U.S. sales, valued at over $600 million. SSAB, Sweden's biggest steelmaker, is considering relocating operations to the United States to bypass the tariffs, a move that could cost 2,500 domestic jobs. The automotive industry is also in crisis. Volvo Cars' U.S. exports, 40,000 vehicles annually, face a price hike of at least $3,000 per unit, according to an internal report leaked to Dagens Industry. The Wall Street Journal reports that Volvo's South Carolina plant is shifting production to Chinese and Belgian factories to avoid U.S. tariffs. Scania, Sweden's truck giant, warns that higher steel costs could shrink profit margins by 6 to 9% in 2025, forcing potential layoffs. This is an existential moment for Swedish manufacturing, says Johan Järvklo, chairman of the Swedish Metalworkers Union. Sweden could have pursued a bilateral deal with Washington, as the UK did after Brexit, but the risks outweighed the rewards. The EU accounts for 52% of Sweden's total exports, while the United States represents only 8.7%. Breaking away from Brussels' collective response could have jeopardized Sweden's access to 1.1 trillion euros in annual intra-EU trade, a far bigger concern than losing $18 billion in annual US exports. Moreover, Brussels has far greater bargaining power than Stockholm alone. The EU's latest $10 billion tariff package against US products, targeting industries from bourbon to microchips, is a direct counterstrike designed to force Washington back to the table. Sweden cannot fight the United States alone, explains Cecilia Malmström, Sweden's former EU trade commissioner. Aligning with the EU is the only way to exert real pressure. Sweden's export diversification efforts are in motion, but they won't replace U.S. trade anytime soon. China, Sweden's biggest non-Western trading partner, saw a 22% increase in Swedish imports last year, particularly in electronics, biotech, and precision machinery. However, diplomatic tensions over Huawei bans and human rights disputes limit further expansion. The Middle East and Africa remain secondary markets. Despite IKEA's regional dominance, Sweden's total exports to Africa and the Middle East combined are just $9.3 billion annually, less than half of its U.S. trade volume. While Africa's economic growth presents long-term potential, logistical bottlenecks and political instability make short-term gains unlikely. China is an option but not a lifeline, warns Erik Thedéen, head of Sweden's Financial Supervisory Authority. The U.S. remains too crucial to cut off entirely. Sweden's largest companies aren't waiting for a resolution. They're making aggressive moves to mitigate risks. Volvo is expanding manufacturing in Belgium and China, with CEO Jim Rowan confirming that U.S. production will be scaled down if tariffs persist. IKEA, which imports $3.2 billion in goods from the US annually, has redirected 30% of its logistics network to new suppliers in Vietnam and Poland to avoid potential price spikes. Scania, which relies on US imported engine components, has begun negotiations to source parts from South Korea and Mexico instead. Swedish companies are diversifying supply chains faster than at any point since the 2008 financial crisis, says Handelsbanken chief economist Christina Nyman. The cost of inaction is too high. Sweden's strong stance appears decisive, but internally, there's division. While the Kristersson government backs EU retaliation, Sweden's powerful business lobby is warning against escalation. The Confederation of Swedish Enterprise, representing 60,000 companies, has urged Stockholm to pursue diplomatic talks rather than risk permanent trade damage. Even within the government, concerns are growing. Finance Minister Elisabeth Svantesson warned in a recent statement that Sweden's retaliation could shave 0.5% off GDP in 2025, citing falling exports and rising production costs. Despite strong public rhetoric, Stockholm is internally debating the limits of its economic resistance. Sweden's high-tech and pharmaceutical sectors stand at serious risk if US-EU tensions escalate further. The US remains Sweden's second-largest export market for pharmaceuticals, with companies like AstraZeneca and Resapharm shipping $2.7 billion in medical products annually. If the US retaliates with targeted tariffs, these firms could see a 15 to 20% profit decline, forcing job cuts and R&D slowdowns. The tech sector isn't immune either. Sweden's Ericsson, which supplies 18% of 5G infrastructure in North America, could face restrictions mirroring those placed on Huawei. Sweden risks collateral damage in a trade war it didn't start, warns Robert Bergqvist, senior economist at SEB Bank. Pharmaceuticals and telecom have been untouched so far, but Washington could easily change that. Sweden is walking a geopolitical tightrope. While it supports Brussels' countermeasures against US tariffs, Stockholm remains economically dependent on American trade. The EU accounts for 52% of Sweden's exports, but US markets drive nearly 20% of its foreign direct investment inflows. Some analysts argue that Sweden's lukewarm commitment to EU retaliation is a hedge, avoiding alienation from Washington while maintaining credibility in Brussels. Sweden is in a bind, says Anna Stellinger, head of trade at the Confederation of Swedish Enterprise. Pulling back weakens EU unity, but full commitment risks long-term economic strain. With NATO accession still fresh, Sweden must also weigh whether economic escalation could impact its newfound military alignment with the US. A wrong move could leave Sweden isolated from both blocs, forcing costly trade concessions in the future. Sweden's aggressive stance might appear like a seismic policy shift, but behind the headlines, there's evidence it's more symbolic than substantive. The EU's retaliation package, which Sweden supports, largely targets American consumer goods, agriculture, and specialty metals, sectors that have minimal impact on Sweden's trade mix. Internally, the Swedish government remains divided. Finance Minister Elisabeth Svantesson has voiced concerns that prolonged escalation could shave 0.5% off GDP by 2025, while business leaders warn that a full-blown trade war would raise production costs by 9 to 12% across key industries. If the retaliation is a bluff meant to pressure Washington into negotiations, it's a dangerous one, because if the US retaliates further, Sweden may be forced to follow through with trade restrictions it can't afford to sustain. If the situation escalates into a full-fledged economic battle, Sweden could face deep financial consequences. The European Union has drafted contingency tariffs worth $20 billion, targeting US exports like automobiles, tech components, and agricultural goods. If enacted, Sweden's largest firms, Volvo, SKF, and Ericsson, could experience supply chain bottlenecks and rising raw material costs. Analysts at Handelsbanken predict that a prolonged trade war could reduce Sweden's GDP growth by 1.2 percentage points in 2025, pushing the country toward a technical recession. The US is also considering countermeasures beyond tariffs. Washington could restrict access to critical semiconductor technology, hurting Sweden's growing AI and robotics sectors. Trade wars never end where they start, warns Carl Bildt, Sweden's former prime minister. Today it's tariffs. Tomorrow it's technology embargoes, investor restrictions, and currency pressures. If Sweden finds itself caught in a sustained economic confrontation with the US, it may be forced to shift its trade alliances permanently. China is an obvious alternative, as Swedish exports to China grew 22% last year, driven by demand for industrial machinery, biotech, and luxury consumer goods. However, deeper trade with China comes with geopolitical risks. Closer alignment with Beijing could provoke US scrutiny over Sweden's 5G and semiconductor sectors. Meanwhile, Sweden is quietly ramping up trade ties with India and Brazil, both of which offer lower regulatory risks than China and have emerging demand for Swedish industrial technology. Diversification is not a choice anymore. It's a necessity, says Christina Persson, former Minister for Strategic Development. The US will remain important, but Sweden must prepare for a world where American trade policy is no longer reliable. A diplomatic off-ramp still exists, but time is running out. Behind the scenes, Swedish trade officials are pushing for a conditional tariff suspension, modeled after the US-UK deal that exempted British steelmakers from certain duties. However, Washington remains unmoved as the White House sees the EU's retaliatory stance as evidence that Sweden is fully aligned with Brussels. Trade analysts at Carnegie Europe suggest that a temporary tariff freeze could be negotiated if Sweden offers more flexibility on US digital tax concerns, but no formal talks have begun. If diplomacy fails, Sweden could be locked into an economic standoff that reshapes its global trade strategy for the next decade. This isn't just about Sweden. It's about how global trade is being rewritten in real time. The European Union's response, the US's next move, and Sweden's balancing act will define global markets for years to come. Will Sweden find a way out of this confrontation? Or is this the first step in a major economic realignment away from Washington? Let's hear your thoughts. Is Sweden making a calculated power move? Or is it gambling with its future? We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your screen.